I'm Vivian Schiller. I'm Executive Director of Aspen Digital, and I'm really thrilled to be here with you today. This month, as everyone knows, marks the one-year anniversary since the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Depending on your point of view, that day was either a testament to democracy's resilience, or it was a bullet that we just narrowly dodged. More troubling, at least to me, is what's happened since then. The growing hold that the big lie has on so many Americans, troubling changes to voting rules, and the increasing polarization, so much of it racially motivated, is very disturbing. All indications that we cannot take our democracy for granted, and also stark evidence that some communities are at more risk than others. So what do we do? That's the question. I am really lucky to be joined here today by Rashad Robinson, the president of Color of Change, which is the leading racial justice organization driven by more than 7 million members who are building power for Black communities. I'm also happy to call Rashad my friend and the co-chair of the recently wrapped Aspen Commission on Information Disorder, which looked at solutions and actual actionable steps that government, private industry, and civil society can take to help repair some of the challenges to our really toxic information ecosystem. Our panel is called "How Can Activism Repair Democracy?" And we're really lucky to have Rashad because, of course, Color of Change is a leading activist organization. So first of all, hello, Rashad, welcome.
Thank you.
Before I start talking to you, so nice to see you and Happy New Year. We were talking just before we started recording this panel, and you made an interesting point about the title. Again, how can activism repair our democracy? You took exception with the word repair, which implies fixing something that maybe was perfect beforehand, or maybe not so much. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, when I think about repair, as the son of a contractor, as a person who sometimes has to fix things myself, I think about how do we restore something? How do we make something the same as it once was, or operate the way that it used to operate? And for this country to truly sort of move forward, we can't think about our democracy as something that we repair, but constantly thinking about how do we make sure that our democracy actually works for the time. And that means that we have to not think about how to go backwards, but constantly think about how do we go forward? How do we constantly expand the table, expand the number of seats, recreate the table so that more of us have a voice, and that the ways in which we're able to come together deal with all the deep levels of imbalances to power and access and opportunity. And so, the work in order to make democracy work for all of us, in order to make sure that we all have a voice, regardless of whether we are privileged or vulnerable, in the majority or the minority, or in favor or out of favor with whoever may be in power at any particular time, means that we have to constantly engage the rules of our democracy and make sure that they are situated to include all of our voices in all of our communities.
I couldn't agree with you more. Making this more challenging than it would be ordinarily is the fact that the very foundations of democracy, to many, feel a little bit rocky right now. It'd be one thing if we had the same kind of maybe confidence in democracy as we had prior to the Trump era, quite frankly. But now we have a really rocky foundation upon which to also look at a much more inclusive, a much more participatory democracy. So how do you think about these challenges and the work of your organization on top of concerns about things like, will the next presidential election vote, certifications overturned on the state level? We've got really fundamental issues for all Americans.
Yeah, I mean, in so many ways, I've had a lot of time to reflect on this. We're coming right off of, honoring and celebrating the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. And when I think about the legacy of Dr. King, I not just think about him as sort of a leader, but all of the folks who participated in continuing that work of making our democracy work. The efforts to bring about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, two seminal pieces of legislation that actually were written rules around how our democracy should work, but recognizing that all of these things require people. They require people and institutions to continue to uphold them, to continue to recognize that we have a shared faith, that we are better together, working together, than we are sort of fighting for our own individual concerns, and that the ideas of whether or not we may disagree politically around issues shouldn't sort of supersede the ideas of all of us having a voice. And I think when I think about that, I think about the role of leadership across many sectors. And Vivian, we talked about this a lot in the Aspen Commission report, the role of leadership and actually dealing with misinformation and disinformation, and not just leadership from government, but leadership across the private sectors, the role of corporate America, the role of institutions in the academy, or institutions that uphold standards in journalism, or in the medical world or in the legal world, and who we platform and uplift and how we hold one another accountable. In order to make sure our democracy works for all of us, we're going to actually need all of us to participate like it's in danger, and to recognize that it only will work if all of us sort of engage in a way that recognizes the sort of deep vulnerabilities any institutions have when people have to come together to make them work.
It's interesting, Rashad, you talk about the sense of feeling that our democracy is vulnerable. And I think that, for communities of color, that's probably been a long-standing sentiment. For many others, it's a brand new phenomenon to feel that that democracy is not is at risk, and is at risk at not serving all Americans. And so, anyway, I just wanted to reflect on that for a moment.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that all of our voices might not be heard, or votes might not be certified, or that our participation, might not be counted as legitimate is not a new concern for communities of color. And even this idea of vulnerability, right, which can oftentimes be seen as a personal trait, when in fact, it's not just that our democracy is vulnerable in some sort of benign way. The democracy is under attack. It's under threat, because this idea of democracies that work for all of us is not something that everybody actually wants, right? People want democracy that may just work for them, or democracy that allows them to hold on to more power at the expense of these principles. And even from the very foundations of our democracy, when we looked at who had the right to participate, who had the right to make sure that their voices were heard and could participate, there were always these ideas and these rules put in place to prevent everyone from being able to participate and everyone from being able to be counted. And so if we understand that is part of the sort of condition of how people have come together in this country. My friend Heather McGee talks a lot about the America being a land of ancestral strangers, people who have come from all different lands to try to make something work here in this country. And the idea of a multiracial democracy working and thriving is an experiment. But in any experiment, we have to put our best foot forward and have to do the work to deal with all the ways in which power imbalances, access and opportunity is not something that we can just take for granted.
All right. Well, now that I think we have successfully reframed this panel from how can activism repair our democracy to how can activism give us the democracy we really have always wanted, let's turn now to what can be done. and to the role of activism and how that is deployed. So talk a little bit about, particularly the work that you're doing, Color of Change is doing. Where is that activism showing up, and to what communities or sectors?
Well, at Color of Change, we believe that people don't experience issues, we experience life. That the forces that hold us back are deeply interrelated. So a racist criminal justice system requires a racist media culture to keep it alive, to help it to thrive. The economic inequality goes hand in hand with political inequality. And so we have to focus just as much on power as we focus on any individual issues. And we also cannot mistake presence, visibility, and awareness for power, right? We can oftentimes mistake sort of the ideas that we know about January 6th, and people are talking about it, and maybe stories have been written about it, as enough, right? Presence is really important, and conversations are important, and elevating these issues is important. But power is the ability to change the rules. And so our work at Color of Change every single day is about translating presence into power, giving people strategic ways to take action to hold institutions and leaders accountable. Color of Change was actually founded during what I think of as one of the great failures of our democracy, of our systems over the last 20 years, and that was Hurricane Katrina. And I think about Katrina in a number of ways. I think about our work and think about the work as we move forward, because Black folks were literally on their roofs begging for the government to do something and left to die. And the thing about Katrina is that it once again illustrates all those things that people knew, those issues that people already knew about. In the case of Katrina, you have geographic segregation, generational poverty, the impacts of what we've done to our planet, and all the ways in which structural racism undergirds the failures of so many systems. But at the heart was that no one was nervous about disappointing Black people. And it wasn't just the government, it wasn't just corporations, it wasn't just media, it was all of those institutions. And when institutions are not nervous about disappointing your community, it doesn't matter what kind of research report you have that illustrates all the facts and figures. It doesn't matter what you do in the courts if you don't have the power to implement it. It doesn't matter what folks in Silicon Valley build. We're not going to code ourselves out of systemic racism. And so part of what we try to do every single day through this translating presence to power is building the sort of efforts to hold institutions and decision makers accountable. Because in many ways, that is what democracy is about. It's about us having enough power to hold institutions accountable. And it's about communities being able to build collective action to get the things that they need, to make sure our economy works, to make sure our voices are heard. All of those things are incredibly important. And so that's what we're doing. And we're doing it across a number of issues, but we're doing it with a deep recognition of organizing a base to make that heard. And so sometimes it's about holding corporations accountable for how they engage in our government, how they fund politicians, making sure there's visibility around who's funding those January 6th politicians. It's about holding media and institutions accountable for disinformation and misinformation, holding Silicon Valley accountable and tech platforms accountable, and then working to make sure that we change the rules and the laws along the way. And so, I think about all of those as important, but none of it happens without people. None of it happens without everyday people joining us and making their voices heard.
So you mentioned, I want to get more specific now about how that activism is manifested. So you talked about, I heard you just talk about at least three sectors. You talked about the tech companies. You talked about sort of more broadly corporate America and the way that they're funding or not funding certain political actors. And you talked about government action. So did I capture sort of those three?
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about specifically the work that you're doing in each of those areas and its impacts, and how people that are listening to this, listening to us today can be part of that.
So across Silicon Valley, we're doing work to push tech companies to do racial equity audits, to look at sort of the role and decisions that are being made in their companies as it relates to race. We're working to make real demands on these companies in terms of their policies and their practices every single day. In terms of corporate America, we watched in 2020 as many corporations said Black Lives Matter and committed to actually engaging around their practices around race. And we saw deep failures from moving from statements to action. And we've relaunched something called Beyond the Statement. And Beyond the Statement is a platform that actually focuses on corporate America and really pushes these companies to put in place real actions, real demands. But when I think about all of these things, it's not enough to simply ask companies and corporations to do better if they're not actually held accountable by rules and laws, by structures that make sure that they have to play by the same rules as anyone else, that we can pass laws around civil rights, and those in Silicon Valley can decide whether or not they're going to follow those rules, because those with more money, those with more power can make decisions about what rules work for them and when they have immunity and don't have immunity. And so part of how we sort of have to work across all of these sectors is build up enough energy, build up enough will from the public, and build up enough of the sort of power to make sure that those who make decisions know there'll be consequences for inaction. We have to build all of that to make sure that we are constantly pushing the ball forward. And at Color of Change, we really think about how do we leverage the sort of 21st century tools and the 21st century ways of communicating to be able to help people respond effectively to the injustice around them, but also fight to actually change the rules. So it's not just responding, but it's about building the type of pressure so we get new rules down the road. And going back to this idea of not mistaking presence for power, when we mistake presence for power, we can sometimes think that we've done something that we haven't done just because it can feel good, right? So we can think a Black president means that we are post-racial. It doesn't mean that a Black president's bad, but it means that thinking that we're post-racial actually prevents us from actually dealing with the challenges. We can sometimes think that America loving and celebrating Black celebrities means that America loves Black people as much as America loves Black culture, and America can love and celebrate and oftentimes monetize Black culture and hate Black people at the same time. And those two things don't always have to be in conflict. And so part of how we have to operate across each of these sectors is this idea of power, because communities that have oftentimes been targeted, exploited, held back are not going to win if we don't actually organize and build sort of the engagement. And so I oftentimes say that we will always lose in the back rooms if we don't have the people lined up at the front door. And so across each of these sectors, we recognize the work of lining people up at the front door. And for people who want to be part of that effort, who want to be part of that collective struggle, they only have to join us at colorofchange.org. And at that way, we can help direct you to all of the sort of ways in which we are working every single day to hold these institutions accountable, to build more power, and in the process, making democracy work for all of us.
Yeah, the lines, I think, it's looking around the world today, it's hard not to come to the conclusion that the lines have been drawn, and they're perhaps unmovable in the sense of who remains to be a persuadable, so to speak, who can move from the camp of not being persuaded in these issues being important to become part of the solution. And by that I mean, I'm really let's give it a name. It's Trump has been out of office now for a year, but Trumpism is very, very, very much alive, and tens and tens of millions of people in this country are reading the kind of media that isn't necessarily going to draw them to the same kind of conclusions and draw them to the same kind of agreement of the change that needs to happen. How do you galvanize people at a time when we're so polarized?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that we are honest with ourselves around sometimes the failures of our side to tell a powerful story to people about the pain that they're facing, the challenges that we are really facing. Trump told a story. It was a story of blame, and he blamed immigrants, he blamed Black people, he blamed women, he blamed all sorts of people for the harms and concerns. And he told a story that allowed people to think that their pain was being caused by people who were simply fighting for more equity, for a better tomorrow. But far too often, those who want a democracy that allows us all to participate tell stories of inequality that are unfortunate rather than unjust. And what I mean by that, Vivian, is that we oftentimes hear stories that think about inequality, that kind of animate inequality as almost like a car accident, like it sort of just happened. And when we tell stories that are unfortunate rather than unjust, we get charitable solutions to structural problems. So we will have people thinking that it's enough to send water bottles to Flint instead of holding corporations who don't pay their fair share accountable to make sure our pipes are actually clean. We will think it's enough to have a service day at an inner city school instead of actually dealing with the inequalities in public education. We will think it's enough to simply deal with reentry programs rather than recognizing that in order to deal with the fact that the United States has 4% of the world's population and 25% of the world's incarcerated population, means that we have to address these issues at the structural level. But because these stories are told in ways that oftentimes, even from sort of a language perspective, put the active voice on the people and the passive voice on the system. So we hear people say Black people are less likely to get a loan from the bank instead of saying banks are less likely to give loans to Black people. And on one hand, people may think, that's just semantics, Rashad. But if you say, banks are less likely to give loans to Black people, you actually start questioning what's happening with the banks. On the other hand, you have people asking what's wrong with Black people and trying to fix Black people to deal with institutions which have targeted, exploited, redlined us from the very beginning. And so all of this for us, I like to think about this in terms of what can we do? How can we change our language? How can we build the type of stories and tell the type of stories that actually help people not just feel like they can be on our side, but know how to be on our side, how to fight, how to bring more people in, and then where we need to direct people's energy to actually do the work, right? That, I think, is part of what we can do to address the kind of story that are out there. And to be clear, people who are down the well on misinformation and disinformation are not our audience here, right? It is so many other people who are out here looking at the stories that are being told. And when a big lie about Black history and the teaching of Black history is being told that is trying to sort of ban Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks from our schools, it's not enough to tell people, oh, we're not teaching that. We actually have to tell the story that these are the same people that want to make sure that girls don't learn math, that didn't want gay teachers in school, that wanted to ban evolution and climate change from being taught, and now they want to ban Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. And that is how we tell the stories to people who are watching this and wondering what side to be on and how to be engaged the right way. And I think that the more we can stand up, push back, and tell stories that give people the ability to be on our side, to recognize that we are the protagonists in the American story of democracy, because protagonists are people who constantly have to fight in any story to make something work and face tons of uphill battles in that fight. We will be able to get more people on our side. And we'll be able to face down the villains, whether they are Donald Trump, whether it's Trumpism and all those that will fall sort of behind them, or whether they are the enablers, those that sort of don't play a political side, but will side with whoever may be more profitable to their sort of self-interest, even if it's at the expense of our society.
Yeah. Well, you make such an important point when you're talking about the way stories are told, and even about headlines, which sort of brings us to the media. and the role of the media. In many ways, your point is taken about, we need to move from presence to power. But of course, the media is presence in the case of the media is the power. In many ways, particularly as there are more and more media outlets and camps forming around less, more reliable and less reliable media. I know that's a big area of focus for you. We only have a couple of minutes left, so I want to just give you sort of final word, in terms of that kind of storytelling, and also, a sort of more to end on a more hopeful. Although you're always very hopeful, which I really appreciate it. I'm sort of in a deficit of that these days. Tell us what you're most hopeful for that we can achieve in this coming year.
I'm constantly hopeful in terms of how people are willing to put themselves on the line to engage, to participate, to raise their voices. I think about the summer of 2020, right? When so many of us were quarantined in our homes, if we were privileged enough to be there. I think that there was a time when many people thought that the best this country could do at that time in terms of activism was clap outside of our windows or uplift investigative journalism. And it was racial injustice that drove people into the streets, that pushed people to raise their voices. And when I say people, I'm talking about multiracial groups of people joining together to fight for a better tomorrow together, raising their voices, families coming out, raising their voices, making donations, registering voters, doing so much work to save these ideas of democracy that weren't just about their own personal participation, but about what was about their neighbors' participation. And in a country that has dealt with so much racial strife, that it was founded on the persecution and genocide of Native and Indigenous populations and the servitude and exploitation and violence against Black communities, leaving out women of all races and so many others, that it was racial justice that drove people to action. And so I think the thing I really want to lead people on is that a true democracy will not produce racial justice. Racial justice is going to produce a true democracy. Because in a country that was founded on so much racial strife, our potential, our hope, our opportunity has to live in this idea that all of us can come together to right those harms, to build a better tomorrow. And we know that it's possible because time and time again, some of our best moments as we commemorate Dr. Martin Luther King, as we think about the summer of 2020, have come out of pain, but have been part of this idea of hope. And so I constantly have hope about what a better tomorrow could look like. Media has a role, corporate America has a role, government has a role, and every single one of us has a role to make sure that we are doing everything we possibly can to make tomorrow better for all of us.
Rashad, I am always inspired when I listen to you, and today is no exception. Thank you so much. Those are such inspiring words and really a hopeful message for the new year. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you everybody for being listening to this conversation. All right, thank you. Bye-bye.